Can everybody still hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Good. Let's see. Hello.
Charlie, I can see you looking down
So what?
on the screen.
Elizabeth?
Okay, here we go. So we are live. Great. So welcome everyone. Good night. My name is Tomas Avila, and very much for the last month, I've been running what I have titled Latino Leadership 2020, honoring our past, transforming our present, and leading our future. And what these conversations are about is about the development of the Latino community within the year 2000 and 2020. And the reason I chose 2000 to 2020, because all the documentation that I used for my research, and in particular, research paper that was written back in 2006, described that it was during this period that the Latino community began to gain political power in Rhode Island. And very much that political power that we started gaining in 2000 was totally different than the rest of New England. We started gaining political power faster than most New England cities. So that caught my attention when I found that out. But at the same time, having been part of it with Dr. Pablo Rodriguez and every one of you, at that time, all of the journalists were at the Providence Journal and very much documented everything that was happening in the Latino community and very much play a role and made a difference. So that's what tonight is about. It's about a conversation with journalists and trying to how journalists can help communities and make a difference in communities regarding the progress that is made, but in particular highlighting leadership. Okay, so I have tonight the honor of having Dr. Pablo Rodriguez as a guest, Charlie Bass, Ed Fitzpatrick, and Scott McKay. Scott, Charlie, and Ed, as I mentioned earlier, worked for the Providence Journal at that time, and they did a great job writing about the growing Latino community and everything else that was happening in between. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to be here, Tomas.
Thank you. So we're going to start by, if you can give us a little history about your career as a journalist within those 20 years, but anyway, about your career. Anybody wants to start?
Well, I'm
Ancient for beauty.
I'm ancient. I started at the Providence Journal in the 1960s. And for some of those years, I covered Providence schools. And there was a lot of talk about desegregation of the schools and whatnot. And every school had to be at least 30% Black. I don't believe that Latinos entered the conversation in those days. There must have been some in Providence, but it was all sort of black and white. But I became more conscious of the Latino emerging strength even before you mentioned 2000. You may remember the famous congressional primary in 1996. Dr. Rodriguez will remember it when Joe Paolino squared off against Bob Wagan, who was the lieutenant governor. And Paolino, I don't know what got into his head, but he ran on this English-only sort of anti-immigrant campaign, which was he just came across as stupid, actually. And I wrote something like, you know, with Paolino looking dumb, all Reagan had to do was look intelligent. Anyway, Reagan had a good amount of Latino support. And that was probably my first recognition of what was about to happen. And then in 1997, Luis Aponte started running for the city council, though I think the actual election was in '98. And then you had people like Victor Capion running for the House, and Juan Pichardo or whatever, and things were starting to get interesting.
Hello?
And the Rhode Island
Yes,
Latino
can you hear me?
Political Action Committee.
I'm having problems hearing.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear perfectly.
Okay, so one thing that was interesting, Tomas, can you hear me? Tomas,
Hello?
can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
We can hear you, Tomas, no
Yeah,
problem.
you sound perfectly. So your audio is wrong. So Charlie, I do remember the situation with Paolino, and that was such a serendipitous thing, because you know what actually happened. You know, the way this became a real big issue
Can you hear me?
was during the we can hear you. We can hear you during the Puerto Rican parade. So there was the Puerto Rican parade and the Puerto Rican festival at the Roger Williams Park. And so he wanted to speak. And at that point, the organizer turned to me and said, you know, Paulino wants to speak, but he's into English only. You know, and I told the organizer, listen, you know, people are going to boo, so, you know, don't let him speak. And that became the news, that he wasn't allowed to speak when he was just out of courtesy, not out of, you know,
I'm having some
strategic, you know, oh no, you know, we're going to punish him. It was like, you know, it's going to be embarrassing for him to go up there. Don't do this, you know, don't let him speak. And he became news at that point. And that's when you wrote the article and started just spinning, you know, all over the place that, you know, Paolino was anti-Latino. When he began the race, he actually had a lot of Latino support because he had been around, you know, for a long time as mayor, and you know, and had a lot of friends. But this situation completely just derailed his you know, congressional career. I mean, he could have been elected had it not been for that situation.
Yeah, I think you're probably right, Pablo. As I remember that race, I covered an awful lot of it, and you look back at that and you just wonder why he was so tone deaf. I mean, immigration, this has always been the Rhode Island story, because I've studied this a lot. You can go back to the 1920s in Rhode Island when they had the crackdown on immigration after World War I, the anti-immigration movement. And in those days, it was aimed really at Italian people, at Greeks, at folks from Southern Europe. And one of the things that happened was they passed something called the Peck Act. And that was done in 1924 by a state rep from Barrington. And the idea was, again, to have English first. It was to have English taught in all of the schools in the state, even if it was a parochial school. Now, this really upset the French Canadians up in Woonsocket. It's called the Sentinel Movement. And they were so upset that the priests fought with everyone over this, the state, and then the Irish bishops took the side of the Yankees in this case and said, yes, you're going to have to teach your kids in English, even though the French really cared about protecting their culture and their language. And this thing, believe it or not, went all the way to the Vatican before it got resolved. So you look at this stuff and you realize that anti-immigrant fervor, this English first, this kind of stuff, unfortunately, isn't new. And it was fascinating to me to see how this raised its head again back in, the 1990s, which I couldn't believe. And of course, I had covered earlier the Juan Pichardo campaign, and it was fascinating to me to do a lot of work on that and realize that the organization, the ground up organization, this was the same that the Irish and Italian immigrants had done. And I want to say one thing about Providence. If you look back from when I was a young reporter, in the 80s, I remember the first primary that I ever really covered was when Buddy Cianci crashed and burned the first time. And I think they had a big primary, and it was like in the 80s, whoever of the 6 or 7 Italo-American candidates who ran in the Democratic primary, you were almost sure that one of them was going to be the next mayor. And from that vantage point, and Charlie was around then, and we were chatting about this briefly at lunch, but I don't think back in 86 or 88 that I ever thought that today in 2020 that Providence would have had 2 Latino mayors. And I think, Pablo, you probably are surprised at that too.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. We used to have a phrase on the radio, 10 en el 2010. So that was 10 in 2010. So we were like aspiring for the stars, to have 10 Latino electeds at anything.
Right.
In the state. And now, how many will we have, Tomas? I mean, 30?
24.
24?
Yeah, 24 elected officials.
Including statewide and including places like Central Falls. I was talking to Helene Cooper the other day, who's now at the New York Times, covers the Pentagon, and she covered Central Falls when she worked for the Journal years ago. And she could not believe that in those days,
24.
that in those days, Central Falls, it was like they had a majority Latino population, many of them Colombian, but these folks weren't given anything at City Hall. And it was all the older generation of white folks who kept them down, frankly. And she looked at me. We were doing a Zoom thing the other day. We do this about once a month with some Journal alums. And she said, really? Central Falls has a Latino mayor? And I said, yeah, and he's a good guy. He's not a crook like the other guy was. And he's doing a good job. She said, well, that's fabulous, because she never thought that would ever happen.
Central Falls was the first campaign of the Rhode Island Latino Political Action Committee.
Mm-hmm.
That was the first campaign when we bought this ugly yellow t-shirts that you could see them like 20 miles away. In that respect, we were a little bit like Trump. You got to market it,
right?
So we had these t-shirts that were so yellow that you could see them at night. It was like they glowed, and really in reality we were not even 12, 15 people walking around Central Falls trying to get Ricardo Patiño elected councilman. And people kept seeing the t-shirts, and they said, this was a machine that was out there getting the vote, when in reality it was just a few guys dressed in yellow.
Yeah, I'm impressed by what Charlie said too when he covered schools back in the 60s. I mean, there were virtually no Hispanics at all in the Providence schools, and today the largest group again is Hispanic as far as the students go. And one thing I've written about even recently is that I wish the district had more emphasis on hiring more minority teachers. One of the big problems in Providence is that the teaching force looks much different than the students. And I think that over the long term, you've got a problem there. I look at the police, and I will say, Chief Clements has done a pretty darn good job the last several classes that he's had. that they've had of new police cadets, and they have been a majority of minority folks and women. And that never used to be the case in Providence. So while there's still a long way to go, you've come a long way too. The group has come a long way. And I think that that's true. And now I just also see, though, the problems with the ESL in the schools. And when Donald Trump's Justice Department says that you're not doing the right thing by your ESL students, which they did like 3 years ago, you've got a problem. I mean, this is a big problem. And the city finally say they're going to start addressing it, but so far they really haven't.
I will say that one thing that hasn't changed over the years is that Dr. Rodriguez gives great quotes for his stories. I looked up the first I looked up the first time I wrote about Dr. Rodriguez was back in December 2001, and at the time they were redistricting. At the same time they were downsizing the General Assembly, so huge changes in the electoral map. And there were threats of lawsuits because they were packing. In the Senate map in particular, they said they were packing a high percentage of minorities into the South Side district, depriving nearby districts of the numbers needed to elect another minority senator. And the quote from Dr. Rodriguez at the time was, "The veneer of inclusiveness is but a cruel hoax on the disenfranchised and the poor." And then that did end up becoming a lawsuit. And because they had Charlie Walton in the same district as Juan Pichardo.
All right, so first confession. The lawsuit was a shell. we were just, again, when we were faced with the situation, with the maps, we called the ACLU and they couldn't help, and we got this lawyer from Boston that said, yeah, I'll help you guys for nothing. And we put together a bunch of organizations, just basically called them on the phone and said, listen, we need your name to put in this lawsuit, and we're going to form this voting rights coalition, which was just made in the moment. And we literally just got everybody's names that we could and plastered it on the lawsuit, as the Voting Rights Coalition of Rhode Island. And we actually were successful, in changing the maps, that finally created the map that elected Juan Pichardo.
And wasn't Angel Tavares? Didn't he have a role in the coalition at the time?
Oh, absolutely. Angel was our lawyer. So Angel wrote the bylaws for the Rhode Island Latino Political Action Committee. He was the consigliere for this whole thing, for the PAC, for the lawsuit. He was always there. And I still remember when he came to my office and said, I'm thinking of running for Congress. And I'm like, running for Congress? Are you crazy? You're just starting. Why are you running for Congress when you have so many other opportunities? And obviously he was crushed, in his Congress aspirations, but it was a good training for him to become mayor.
And Tomas the other day a couple months ago, sent me a photo from 20 years ago, which made me realize how old I've been getting. Because I look so young in this photo of interviewing Nelly Gorbea when she was, I think, with Real PAC, right?
She was the second chair of Real PAC after me.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll never forget, because Charlie had done some stories about Tavares in 2000. Was quite a primary. Langevin ended up winning. Kevin McAllister and Kate Coyne McCoy were also in there, I believe.
That's right.
And I'll never forget, one of the Journal editors said, would you go out and cover this guy's press conference? I know he's not going to win, but we want to know and find out something from him when you're there. And the editor said, how does he pronounce his name? I mean, this is from Fountain Street. So I go out there, I talk to Angel. I pulled him aside after the press conference because I didn't want to sound any dumber than I looked. So sure enough, I said, Angel, how do what is he? He said, well, it's Tavares. Okay. But unless I'm in East Providence, in that case, Tavares is just fine. And I said, this kid has a future in Rhode Island politics.
Right.
I mean, classical high school, Dartmouth and Harvard, Georgetown Law School. He was very good candidate. He just didn't have any money was his
No
big
money.
problem.
Right. The doctor, you said, you couldn't believe he'd be running for Congress with such a, so young or whatever. He told me that people always suspect that you're running for higher office anyway. So he figured, well, why don't I just start doing what I want to do?
It's been the story of my life. I mean, I have denied political aspirations my entire life. I'll help anybody. I'm an advocate. I like to speak, but the last thing I want to do is sit in a room with a bunch of people arguing. So nobody ever believed me. Everybody thought that I had ulterior motives. To this day, they still think I have ulterior motives. And I'm like, okay, it's been now 35 years. What else do I need to do?
Doctor, when you were starting out with the Latino Political Action Committee and Nellie was active on that, did you see her as a future candidate?
Oh, absolutely. The story with Nellie, when I met her as a member of the Hispanic Commission, the first commission that was created by Sondland and Governor Sondland. And she was working at Fleet Bank as a municipal bond specialist. Many people don't even know this. And so I met her and I said, what are you doing in the bank? I'm like, oh, I'm doing municipal. But it's like, you're wasting your time there. You're wasting your talent. You have, great charisma. You could go very, very far. So I convinced her to leave the job in the bank and join the Rhode Island Foundation as a program officer. And she was one of the best program officers the foundation ever had. Everybody was in agreement with that. And that was the bug that bit her, in terms of the community involvement. Then became part of Housing Works. She founded Housing Works, then went to work for the governor of Puerto Rico for a couple of years, and then came back. And the rest is history. She became the Secretary of State with no money also, but with a wonderful grassroots campaign and one extremely folksy and perfect ad.
It was beautiful. Is she the next governor?
Well, I think that that's the next position for her. I mean, there's no doubt that she would make a great governor. She has the respect of both sides. Very few people in state government, can be in a Republican and in a Democrat gathering and have friends these days. She does. She actually does.
I will say, I think this election cycle is a big test for her. Given the problems we've seen around the country in voting and the way that a lot of people try to suppress the vote, and we've seen these awful things around the country, I do think that there's going to be a lot of mail ballot deals. There's going to have to be social distancing for in person. And she and the Board of Elections are going to have a real challenge, I think, making sure that everything's done honestly and well, and things move well in both the September primaries, which are very important, and then, of course, in what I think is going to be the most consequential and maybe the most contentious presidential election cycle of most of our adult lives. And some of us are getting up there in age.
Well, Osvaldo Castillo moved out of Providence to Puerto Rico, so we're not going to have too many issues. And those of us who have been around remember Osvaldo Castillo and mail ballots. As a matter of fact, the creation of the Latino PAC was as a result of the Latino politics before the PAC.
Right.
Which was people like Osvaldo would go to the candidate and say, "Give me some money."
Right.
And I'll get you votes.
They used to call it walking around monny.
Yeah, walking around money. And he did. I mean, and he was very successful and very, very effective at delivering votes. But people didn't even know what they were voting for.
Of course.
And the PAC was basically a way of not just educating the community, but also educating the politicians about what they needed to do, that they didn't need to buy votes. They didn't need to hire Osvaldo Castillo to win. You could win with the issues, but they didn't know what the issues were. So part of the process of the PAC was really teach candidates, what the issues were as a result of the questionnaire that we produce every year. And every year, it helps them. And it helps the PAC because they pay money into the PAC. The other confession that I had to make is to Charlie, because Charlie was the person that made the PAC real, in the sense that every time he wrote about it, it just created ripples that made our phone ring, and had the politicians calling, I'm running for so and so. You guys are interested in my campaign? And it was a result of what Charlie was writing. And when Charlie was writing about the PAC, there were days when we would call a meeting and only one person would show up. One person. We had a meeting with Jose. My God, the brothers. I can't remember his last name. Where he just showed up. And I said, wait, hey, you're here. If you don't ask for a quorum, we could just run the meeting, have minutes, and we'll be done. And we actually ran the meeting with two people. But that gave us, credibility. And what we were trying to do at the same time is write op-ed pieces, which until that point, no Latino was writing anything on the paper. So letters to the editor, op-ed pieces, and stimulating others to do the same, that basically created a momentum. The other thing that we did is that we purposefully, when we created the PAC initially, we made sure that every country was represented, that it was not the Puerto Rican PAC or the Dominican PAC or the Colombian PAC, it was the Latino PAC. And it was the first time that politically people came together in such way.
Yeah, I've always been impressed by one thing that a lot of folks in the majority community don't learn, but I learned it as a reporter, frankly, that there's a lot of people who think this is a monolithic community.
That's right.
Let me tell you, it's not. It's the League of Nations, and people have different heritages and different backgrounds when it comes to voting. Puerto Rican folks, they've been citizens forever, and they've been voting for a long, long time. And some of the other nationalities that you look at, well, if you were Ecuadorian back in the day, if your name was on a government list back home, that might not be the best thing. You might wake up with a gun next to your ear. And people came from really different countries with different political backgrounds. And you had to understand how they transplanted that and rubbed up against each other here in a new area, and just how well it worked out. I will say the Dominican folks impressed me early on as being very good at organizing.
Oh, yes.
And putting together, I used to call them the new Irish, jokingly, putting together campaigns and understanding what it was about. And I realized that a lot of the Dominican folks actually still cared about politics back in their home country.
Yeah.
And it was fascinating to me to see all of these different strains come together and actually get along after some initial friction.
Yeah.
But then because of people like you and some other folks, Victor Capion in the community, Juan Pichardo, and a whole bunch of other folks got together and said, look, if we keep fighting with each other, we're not going to get anywhere. But if we coalesce and combine, we can make this community better for all of us. And I think that message did get through. It might have taken a couple of election cycles, but you seem to be able to do that pretty quickly. I would say, looking at history, faster than, for instance, the rivalry between the Irish American and Italian American folks were.
No, and what has happened here has been the envy of Boston and Massachusetts.
I can see
come
that.
Here. They asked for our bylaws. They thought it was a document. How did you guys do it? I mean, they thought it was just a document or whatever it is that that we did, that they found, just absolutely amazing, that they had been in Boston for so long, Puerto Ricans in Boston and Central Americans in Boston, and they could never, ever get together. They still can't get together.
Right.
They still haven't been able to have the same success that we've had here in Rhode Island. But I wanted to ask Charlie a question, because, Charlie, you were really writing stuff that nobody else was writing about Latino politics. And I was wondering, how was the editorial board? How was, what kind of letters, what kind of calls were you getting at that time?
Well, the editorial board had nothing to do with me. I operated, the newsroom was separate from the editorials because there's no editorial board at all today,
Yes.
I was given the free rein by my editors. I think they just, their attitude is, look, we give you this space. Now you go out and fill it. Don't bother us. And I think that I covered the Latino politics, as you were, for a couple of reasons. One is it was new, it was like the coming thing. And earlier in my career, I covered, there were a lot of things about government reforms and open meetings and things like that. When I was covering Providence schools, it was desegregation. Anyway, with the Latinos, it was a new community. You could see it was going to be gaining strength. It was very colorful. I enjoyed going with the politicians like Sheldon Whitehouse and eating at the Latino restaurants. And I learned to like Chivo. And so that was interesting. And I must say that the Latino people that I met, the candidates themselves, the campaign managers, just people in the campaigns, were very open. And it was a pleasure to talk to you. Some communities you would find very, very sort of secretive, suspicious of the press. And the Latino community was very accommodating to me, very complimentary to me. Your organization gave me a plaque one night. I remember it very well because
a plaque one night. We gave you the first Bill Richardson Award for political reporting.
That's right.
That's a historic award. Right. You were the first reporter ever recognized by this community.
I think it was glass.
Yes.
It was a Saturday, and I remember I was at a Red Sox playoff game. And I thought, wow, what would make me leave a Red Sox playoff game? And that was to come to your affair that night.
And Bill Richardson was here.
Right. He was quite a character himself.
Yes.
Former pitcher in baseball.
Yes.
The Cape Cod League. So anyway, so the Latinos, it was a matter of covering. It was like three different things. One was covering the candidates themselves, which was a little slow going at first, but also the Latino sort of population, so that, as I say, other candidates would be vying, like Leach, Richard Leach running, or Don Cacciari. These different candidates would be, the Latinos became a force in these elections. So that was part of it. And then in my later years, there were some very nasty issues going on, with particularly with Cacciari, and the way he tried to politicize, exploit the immigrant issue, which I found by then I had pretty much free reign to write anything I wanted. And I remember writing some really, really nasty things about him, to the point where he stopped talking to me. And it got very, very unpleasant, but it was interesting.
One of the things that really opened my eyes was the 2000 census. And back in those days, the Journal we had a lot of people in the newsroom, and they picked myself and a guy named Ariel Sabar, who later went on to the Baltimore Sun. And we took a look. We had people who are really good with computers. We took a look at the whole city of Providence, looked at the Tiger files. We went deep and deep. Which neighborhood has switched the most in 10 years? and it turned out to be Silver Lake. And so we looked at it. Really interesting way to do it was we looked at the politics, we looked at the churches, we went to the little leagues, and it's really, you know, instead of these dry census reports, percentages, and oh, there's this many Latino folks living there, we actually went into the neighborhood, went to the restaurants, went to this emerging community, and you saw things that you really could see the future. You'd go to, like, you know, this one church, and I forgot if the priest is even still there, but for lack of interest, he had gotten rid of the Italian language mass. And about a year later, he put in a Spanish mass because he realized the whole new community was Spanish. So I'll never forget a couple Sundays, I said, all right, we got to see how this works. Then, because of the older people in the parish, he decides, the St. Bartholomew's Church over in Silver Lake, he decides to bring back the Italian language mass. But the priest said, see what I mean? Come to mass. So I went, Ariel was Jewish. He says, I don't know anything about this. I said, I'm Protestant. I don't know anything. Yeah, but at least you're Christian. So you go to church, see what's up. You go to the Italian language mass and you do the count. And, you know, they always have the ushers. Our church, we do the same thing. There's a count. And there'd be like 40 people there, 45 people there. You know, just some old blue hairs and domes, and maybe a daughter or granddaughter studying Italian at PC. And then you'd have the Spanish mass, and there'd be like 250 people. It was like standing room only. And these are the kinds of harbingers you see. This is a neighborhood change. And the same with the Little League. You could see the younger players, the older guys were all, frankly, Yankee fans, Italian fellows. And the younger people, you'd have to translate. The kids would have to translate for their parents because they were bilingual. Whereas their parents, a lot of them only spoke Spanish. So they'd say, what time's practice? And they would deal with the coaches and their parents. They would actually translate for the parents. And it was fascinating to see how institutions change. And of course, then the political structure too of that whole side of the community changed.
I think I remember that story, Scott. Wasn't the Little League team the Senator Igliazzi's?
Yeah, the Igliazzi's, that's right.
Right.
Back in the day.
Well, Silver Lake was the Igliozzi's.
There was. That was their, they ran it like a barony.
That's right. That's right.
And Vinny Igliozzi was kind of the ward boss.
See, these are the type of stories that I wanted to put out there because and I realized that you guys, again, documented that history. And as Dr. Pablo Rodriguez stated, when I told him that I was going to do this, he said to me, well, that's great because historians write the history, but the reporters are the first one who start documenting that history. And again, based on everything that I kept reading about all of you in your writings, is this history, is everything that you're sharing and that you have shared so far that I wanted to put out there. And thank you for carrying on because I had some technical issues, but definitely I'm back. And the other, talk about the census, but then also we had the redistricting of 2002. Which, as Dr. Pablo mentioned, you know, we had a lawsuit, but then it extended and it went on, and actually the Senate District 2 was actually we got two Senate districts out of it, and again, so I thank you for this because definitely this is what I wanted to bring. So continue on.
Plus $15,000. We got a $15,000 settlement from the state of Rhode Island.
Yep.
In order to put away the lawsuit. So,
Well, the interesting thing is, though, in those days, if you look at the history of political immigration in this country and in New England especially, what's happened to the Latino community and what's changed in a big way is that now with Nelly Gorbea being elected statewide, you're looking at more than just people who represent the neighborhood.
Right.
And that's what happens when you start to build that from the neighborhood. People go up to the state house, they do a good job, they make some friends, they show that they can do the job, and then people in the larger community are much more likely to give your candidate a shot when you have a good candidate, someone who's as well educated and as savvy as Nelly Gorbea is.
Exactly. And you remind me of Mayor Taveras when he ran for Congress in 2000, and the media tried to box him into the Latino candidate, and his response was always, no, I am a candidate. I am a political candidate. I don't want you to box me into, the Latino thing. And also a few years back, a friend, we were talking, and she said to me, she says, Tomas, you guys have done something really well. And it is that, exactly what you just mentioned. You started in the neighborhood, but you no longer are a neighborhood, not neighborhood politics. You're not even in the state. She said, because you guys are national, because you got national attention, and eventually you're going to start electing, Congress people and senators, which reminds me of an article that Charlie wrote back in 1998 when Victor Capellan ran. And the title of it was A Young Latino Starts a Career. And in that, maybe political, but in that article, he mentioned, he mentioned the fact that maybe senators one day. And then to have the first Latina elected in New England, so definitely it has made a huge difference.
I found the quote you're talking about when Angel started running for Congress, actually 1999 for the 2000 seat. And the paper,
Hold the sheet up so they can see
this
it.
is a computer, the paper ran a story. I don't know who wrote the story, but the headline was Latino lawyer announces bid for Congress. And then I think it was the next day, I asked him about being Latino. And he said, well, it is who I am. First of all, I celebrate it. I'll always celebrate it. I'm very proud of it. I'm very fortunate. I'm so happy that I'm able to speak Spanish. But he said, people need to know there's more to his story. He said he's a Latino lawyer, but he's also a litigator lawyer, a Providence lawyer, a big firm lawyer. He worried that the headline calling him a Latino lawyer might lead some voters to think, oh, he's just for the Latino community. He said, I'm not. So interestingly, when he ran for governor, he wasn't such a great candidate. This was after he was mayor. He was very dramatic that he was mayor, but when he ran for governor, he wasn't such a hot candidate. And of course, he had some good, he had Gina running against him, and she was tough.
I just think that was another case of where Angel did not have sufficient financial resources as one of the big reasons. And Clay Pell was in there, kind of put up to it by the teachers union. And I still wonder, had he been financed well and it was a one-on-one, Raimundo and Taveras, I'm not sure Raimundo would have won.
You can't run for mayor of Providence with the money from the east side, and then quit halfway.
That's a problem.
Okay? I mean, that's a problem. I mean, that's the bottom line. There's not that many people in Rhode Island that can write a big check, and in Providence, there's only a place where you can get the biggest checks. And I think that was a problem there. Had he stayed for 2 terms, he would be governor today.
Yes.
Doctor, what do you see next for Mayor Diosa in Central Falls? He's in his final year.
I don't know. I've been trying to push him forever because I'm like, this is going to come to an end. You can't just wait until you're out to decide what it is that you're going to do. You have to start working for it right now. So, there's this wonderful, lieutenant governor place that is a good parking place for many people aspiring for higher office. And it's not a heavy lift. So that would be my advice.
The Secretary of State office will be opening up too.
That's true.
And then meanwhile, you've got Alorza can't run for mayor again.
That's correct. Well, he has to run for governor.
Okay, so there he could run into Nellie Gorbea, he could run into Seth Magaziner and this guy McKee.
Yep.
So-
Sounds like the 2022 election.
Right. I used to get paid to do this. Governor Garrahy said to me once, he says, you spend more time thinking about politics than I do. And I said, well, Governor, I get paid to.
Yeah, I look at the 2022, and I know Ed knows a lot about this. I kind of look at that Democratic primary as a 6-car pileup on Route 95. It seems like everybody wants to be mentioned and wants to get in there. I do think McKee understands that his only real chance is if Raimondo gets a cabinet post and she leaves, and then of course he becomes governor, and he would be the incumbent for the last 2 years of her term. And otherwise, I think there are 5 or 6 candidates who, even Joe Paolino talks about it. Good Lord.
Yeah, it seems like it's going to be, well, so far it's going to be a crowded one, and and needless to say, it's going to be very interesting. But the one thing that I'm looking at, and you all alluded to, but Dr. Pablo Rodriguez mentioned, Nellie is one of the candidates, and there's going to be a lot of money thrown into it, but she has done a successful job as Secretary of State, and she has very much transformed that office. So in my thinking, she had, of course, nothing is sure, but I think she has a very good chance for 2022 for governor.
Yeah, I think she does. I think that we don't know what it's going to look like yet. We've got this pandemic, we've got the recession. Politics could look much different 2 years from now. I know Charlie and Ed and Pablo and Tomas, you've all been through this. It's hard to have a crystal ball right now with everything that's going on. I think if you polled Nellie, you would find that her favorability rating is quite high. And she's a very good candidate. On the other hand, who knows what the electorate's going to be looking for 2 years from now. And somebody who runs an election or does a fine job as Secretary of State, if the state's in a big recession, they might be looking for something different. So it's hard to tell.
It is.
What do you think, Ed? Ed follows this pretty
I
closely.
do think that when you look at those the 3 statewide officers and Mayor Lorza, that's quite a formidable primary on the Democratic side. You got Jeff Grabowski's looking at it, maybe as a independent or who knows where he would jump in, and then on the Republican side, Blake Filippi or somebody like that. So yeah, everybody's eyeing it, but I think those are the top names you hear.
Dr. Rodriguez, if Alorza and Nellie were both running for governor, this is probably a luxury in a way that you wouldn't have imagined 20 years ago. But what happens to the Latino vote in a situation like that?
It'll be very interesting because, both of them have constituencies in the Latino community. And it will definitely be splitting, some votes in the Latino community. The good thing for Nellie is that she has been going all over the state. So you can't win with just Providence. You have to, win the state. And she is very well liked in many of the Democratic committees throughout the state. They endorse her, they love her, they invite her to speak, many times. So she has connections statewide that are going to be more difficult for Jorge to establish because he has been so Providence centric. And you know how, the suburbs look at Providence, that place that takes all the money.
Then again, about 20% or more of those Democratic votes in the primary are right out of Providence.
That is correct. That is correct.
True. Yeah.
But unfortunately for Jorge, the situation in Providence is not going to get, better.
Any better? No,
In
it's
2
not.
years. I'm sorry, but I've been saying this on my radio show. We are heading for a wall, and regardless of how good he has managed the finances, municipal bonds are going to be challenging. The debt is going to be challenging for the city, and the pensions are going to be challenging, and layoffs are coming. You can't possibly tax people in Providence anymore to be able to, make do for the money that hasn't come in.
Yeah, it's always been
If
very
there's
hard.
nothing from the federal government, then you can bet your bottom dollar that hundreds of people are going to lose their job in City Hall.
It's always been so
Concern.
hard for Providence mayors to make their way up Francis Street there to the State House. And what was the last one? Roberts?
Dennis
Dennis,
Roberts.
Dennis J. Roberts.
Yep. So it's been a while.
Yeah, like the 1950s.
Well, so it's almost 5 minutes to 8. In closing, so now we're dealing with this pandemic, and we just talked, we have an election coming. What do each one of you see in two things? Latino politics and very much the future of Rhode Island. Anyone?
Well, I think there's a great future for Latinos in Rhode Island simply because the community is more professional, it's more educated, it's more engaged, it's more plugged in politically than frankly it ever has been. Now, the future of Rhode Island, look, we got some real problems. There's some big deficits. We don't know what the election is going to be like. Pablo mentioned the Providence pension situation. There are a lot of serious issues. And also within the Latino community, I think there are some educational issues that simply have to be addressed so that the next generation of Latinos has the kind of social mobility and has the skills to deal with both the new politics we're coming into, but also the new economy. So they'll be competitive in the new economy. And I think those are going to be some of the issues that everybody is going to really be focused on.
Yeah, and you mentioned the pandemic. I think the Latino community's front and center there. I've quoted Dr. Rodriguez recently about the fact that 45% of the coronavirus cases in Rhode Island are in the Latino community, far disproportionate level there. And so that is something that even came up in today's press conference with the governor, talking about trying to get Spanish-speaking people to do the contact tracing and improve the testing there. That's right in front and center today. And for the future, I mean, I think definitely the future is bright for Latinos in Rhode Island politics. We could have our first Latino governor. Nelly Gorbea was the first elected statewide officer in New England, Latino, and you do have other rising stars like Mayor Diosa. So they're going to be very relevant.
Well, I also want to add something to what Ed just said. He's right. We are seeing a lot of the inequities of our society come to the forefront during this COVID-19 virus. And it's almost like there's a social distancing inequality. And you see many more people of color who are working on the front lines. They're the people in the nursing homes. They're the people delivering stuff. They're not sitting at home like a lot of other people who have the luxury of working on Zoom and still getting paid and not having to go to the office. They're putting their lives on the line every day. They're the cashiers at the stores when we go to, and they're the folks who are orderlies. They're cleaning the hospital floors. A lot of these folks are the hardworking people that actually we are now finding they're essential. You know, when you talk about who's essential, we always used to look at people's status. Well, we now know very, very bluntly just who's essential. And this is something that we have to address in healthcare, because we know there's a lot of underserved communities in healthcare. You look at what something like Mike Fine is doing up there in Pawtucket and Central Falls is fabulous, but you have to make sure that we are giving folks, the next generation, the kind of template and the kind of model and foundation that they can build on, or else we're all going to fall.
Yeah, I don't think the Latino voice can be ignored anymore. Like last week, I was writing about how the state spent $34 million on the field hospitals that they set up in 3 locations for the pandemic. And they did on an emergency basis and ignored the rule that said 10% had to go to minority contractors. And Senator Cannell from Pawtucket raised the issue and objected. She was on the COVID spending task force, and you know, I don't think they would make that mistake again.
Yeah, I think that, you know, my prediction is that there's a new batch of Latino politicians that are coming up. Young people, very well trained, very well educated, very savvy, but we're going to have increasingly what I used to call the phrase, la genética no hace la política. So genetics does not make good politics. And the time of you having a Latino name and counting on the Latino vote because of your Latino name, that is quickly disappearing. And the quality of the candidate is going to increase. The education of the candidate is going to increase. And that is going to bring dividends, not just to the Latino community, but the entire state of Rhode Island. Charlie, what do you see?
Well, just looking at the politics, I think in general it's very bright, but I see some wrinkles ahead. For instance, we mentioned Elorza and Nellie Gorbea. McKee, who I don't think has been that impressive, but his strength is in the Blackstone Valley, and that could botch things up a little bit. Looking way down the line, if you have Cicilline and Langevin running against each other, that could be one of these races where the Latino vote could be very prominent. They were very, as you know better than I, very influential in getting Cicilline elected mayor. I wrote a column about, here's one from Cicilline winning that primary for mayor. I said, change danced into Providence Tuesday night to a Latin beat. He had this, was referring to his primary election night. The Latinos were there and the music was there, and it was a new era for Providence.
You know, he likes to call himself the first Latino mayor.
Right.
Well,
he can speak Spanish a little bit, so that
right.
helps.
The one who speaks perfect Spanish is Jack Reed. It's amazing.
Yep.
You know, how good he has become. I mean, I've done full interviews with him. It's amazing.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for accepting an invitation to do this, and in particular to share your experiences and time. I greatly appreciate it, and I forever will be grateful to each one of you for this opportunity. So thank you very much, and maybe we shall do it in the future again.
Sure, that'd be great.
Absolutely. Had a great time talking with these guys.
Yep.
And
Great.
have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
Great. You too.
Good night, all.
Leave the meeting.
Doesn't.
Yeah, it's over here. Come up. Yeah.
I'm just going to turn it off. That's fine.